Let's say a word. Lord, thank you so much for all the gifts of life. Thank you for the gift of clothing and food and shelter, friendship and fellowship, love. Thank you for the gift of your Son, for the gift of those who follow him, for the gift of those who have shared about him, for the gift that you give us now of knowing about him, of welcoming him into our lives, of following him. Bless and be with us now as we share a bit more, as we learn a bit more, as we seek to follow him a bit more closely. Bless and be with us and give us the power to do that. All for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, friends, we have 4 more weeks of study after today, and then the women's luncheon. And I'm sorry to report to you, I will not be with you after today. Helen and I leave on Friday for Nashville, Tennessee for a few days of Outreach Foundation board meeting, and then we travel on to Spain. We'll be in Spain just a little while, preparing Spain for the arrival of the Village Church Choir and their tour. So we're on an advanced diplomatic mission there. So we are back in time for the women's luncheon. If it has to do with food, we're back. So there we are, at any rate. But of course, Jan will be carrying on admirably. So we have not yet started discussion. Terry, help me remember this, about what we're going to talk about next year. We've done the whole Bible, so maybe we'll do the whole Koran next year or something like that. I don't know. We'll figure out what that conversation will be. So we are, of course, talking about the whole Bible. I want to make one just quick program note. The date that is on your notes today that was sent out to you is last week. But it's actually the notes for today. How many of you noticed that? Some of you actually read this stuff. That is amazing. That's cool. Well, that's purely my fault, but just scratch out the March date and put in April 7 and 8 there. So last week we talked about the journeys. The journeys. We talked about how the first Christians, in 2 ways kind of, as they simply lived, as they traveled around, as they maybe moved. They would talk about Jesus, the news about Jesus, share that news with others. And then some of them felt specifically called to actually go places, to go everywhere they could, to share the news about Jesus, the resurrection. They were specially called, specially gifted in that way. Of course, we think of Paul, the most famous, the most prolific. He's the one we have the most information about. There were certainly others, people like Barnabas, Timothy, Titus, others that were with Paul. We talked about the fact that because of the Roman Empire and the roads that the empire had built everywhere, the relative sense of peace and security that the presence of the empire brought, all of that made it possible for the Christian message to spread in a positive sort of way. In a negative sort of way, Rome's final elimination of Israel as a nation in 74 meant that the Jews left Israel. They left Palestine. And some of them, of course, were Christian. And wherever they went, they were forced out. This is something that happens with refugee populations. Now, being a refugee is a horrible thing. Let's start that conversation, or say that at the very beginning. Being a refugee is a horrible thing. But one of the silver linings of populations of people being pushed out from where they have been is that they take their culture, their language, their religion, everything about them with them. And it can enrich the world wherever it is. And that, to some extent, that's what happened with the Christian church. So the church started to spread on purpose. People were sharing the news on purpose. They were driven by the Spirit. And the church began to go. Of course, wherever people went and shared about Jesus, a small cell, a small group of people, maybe just 2 or 3 at the beginning, would start to gather, to worship, to pray, to read the Scriptures, to talk about the Scriptures, to talk about Jesus, and the church began to grow all over the place. That's what we talked about last week. And We noted, I hope we did, a sense of thankfulness and gratitude for the people that traveled to share the news. We are the direct beneficiaries of that. At some point in time, somebody shared the news with us. At some point in time, somebody started the church, wherever that was, where we were raised, where we grew up. My own home congregation in New Mexico was started by a famous Presbyterian missionary named Sheldon Jackson, who traveled all over the West and the Southwest and ultimately up into Alaska and started schools and churches everywhere, continuing on that tradition. So this church, the Village Church, was started by people who traveled all the way from La Jolla and came up here and started this church. So we appreciate those folks. So today we want to talk about the proclamation. We want to talk about what it was that these folks said when they traveled. What did they talk about? What was the message, right? What was the early message, the simple message? Of course, it's about Jesus. So one way to think about this is that the first Christian message was about how to live based on what you believe. And that, in a sense, is the theme of all the material in the New Testament after the four Gospels. Now, the four Gospels themselves are about how to live based on what you believe. And of course, they tell the story of Jesus. Once the story is there, once the news about Jesus is there, then people begin to think about sharing that news and talking about what the implications are for us. And that forms the content then of the rest of the New Testament, particularly the letters to the churches. And so we want to focus on that content today. In some sense, the way I see this is that the passages we're talking about today and the general theme we're talking about forms the heart of the knowledge that you and I have and need to have, and also need to stay very closely aligned with if we are going to live successful Christian lives. Some of you have been paying attention to Artemis, right? The new space shot. A lot of us grew up in the early years of the space program, and so much of our attention was focused on the astronauts and the getting to the moon and all that kind of thing. And one of the things that I recall about space travel is that you constantly have to monitor your position and your heading. Because if you get off by the slightest little bit, you're in deep trouble, right? So if I want to walk from here to there, and I get off heading a little bit, I can make corrections, and I can't get off too far, right? Because I can kind of generally see where I am. But if I want to go from point A to point B, and point B is a long way away, and if I start off just slightly off course, or if I get off course just a little bit, I may miss my target by thousands of miles. And of course, in the case of space travel, you're just going to end up out in deep space somewhere. That's the stuff that makes movies about space. That's also possible when it comes to our understanding of Jesus, to our knowledge of the message of the resurrection and how to live because of Jesus. We can start off correctly, but it is very easy, and Christian history proves this, it's very easy to get slightly off course and not even know that you are now going the wrong direction. The part of Christian history where people rightly criticize the life of the church is where the church has gotten off course, has forgotten its essential nature and identity, and forgotten who it is. And so, even though today we're coming back to the heart of Christian faith that all of us know about, it's vital that we come back to that time after time after time, and that we look at where we are, that we make course corrections, that we make adjustments. So if we look at that in that way, then we understand the importance of what we're talking about. So let's go first to Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. And let me talk a little bit about Romans. We have studied Romans in this class. I think it was the very first thing that we did when I got here. We studied the whole letter to the Romans. We took the entire year to do that. And we've done that at least one other time in the last generation here. We've done that because Romans is such an important book for the New Testament, such an important statement of essential Christian theology. And it's that partly because of the nature in which it came about, right? We looked at 1st and 2nd Corinthians last year, and we noted that most of Paul's letters, most of the letters in the New Testament, are written to specific churches in specific places with specific problems and issues. And that is not the case with the letter to the Romans. The same is true of the letter to the Hebrews, by the way. Hebrews was written by somebody who's a very, probably a Jewish Christian, very steeped in the knowledge of the Old Testament and talks about Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And it's written to everybody. In this case, the letter to the Romans is a letter that Paul wrote to a church where he'd never been. He knew some of the people in the church, but he didn't know the church. And so he's not writing about specific problems or situations. He is writing a general theological treatise, if you will, basically saying, here is what I believe. Here is what is the truth about Jesus and about the Christian message. He's doing that as an introduction of himself to the church in Rome. Remember, Paul wants to go to Rome, and then eventually from the base of Rome, maybe pick up some people, certainly pick up some financial support. He wants to go on to Spain. He never gets there because we learned last week that Paul went to Rome as a guest of the Roman government, the Roman justice system. And then, of course, he never left. He was there for 2 or 3 years and then was executed. So he's writing this letter, and rather than just kind of reacting and responding to situations, you have the sense that Paul wrote a first draft, and then a second draft, and then a third draft. This is very carefully edited, carefully composed, very logical discussion and proclamation of the Christian message. And so if you were to want to introduce basic Christian theology, and by basic I mean fundamental, the most important Christian theology, one of the best places to start is with Paul's letter to the Romans, because that's what he's doing by sharing the gospel, sharing basic Christian theology with Rome. And he begins the letter as he begins all of his letters, saying, "Hi, I'm Paul. I'm an apostle of Jesus. I'm this, I'm that, whatnot. Looking forward to being with you. Want to encourage you and want you to encourage me. Want to share in the faith," all that good kind of stuff. And then he starts to talk about the fact that he has been called to be an apostle. An apostle simply means a messenger telling news about Jesus Christ. And then he says, this is the message. And so we're going to focus on verses 16 and 17. That's what you were asked to read of chapter 1. "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." Let me tell you that this passage is one of the most important in the New Testament, in the sense that it is a magnificent summary of the message of the gospel itself. It is important for that reason. It's important also because historically it's had tremendous influence on the church, especially in the last 500 years or so. How many of you here have been Lutheran at one point or another in life? Any Lutherans? Okay. Do you know why this one is so important to Lutherans? It's because when Martin Luther, the Roman Catholic priest, who was ridden with guilt and shame and utterly and horribly depressed and dejected, because he was being taught by the church that he had to follow a certain set of rules and regulations and fulfill certain obligations in order to prove his love to God and earn God's love. That's the way Luther had learned Christian faith. And so much of the church at that time had learned Christian faith. That he basically said, in all honesty, he said, I'm toast. There's no conclusion except the conclusion that I cannot be good enough for God. I'm going to live in hell. Now that would depress anyone, wouldn't it? Of course. But it was when Luther was reading again this passage from Romans that he writes in his biography that all of a sudden his eyes opened and his heart changed and he realized what the actual message of the gospel was. That's one of the reasons it's so important to us, especially those of us who are part of the Protestant part of the Christian family. But then, of course, that great Protestant Reformation brought about Reformation really in all of the church. And it brought the church back to its fundamental course, to its proper direction. And so what is Paul saying here? Well, let's take this apart really just bit by bit. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why would you be ashamed of the gospel? Well, the gospel of Jesus, at its start, is a story about an insignificant Jewish rabbi who was convicted of blasphemy by the religious leaders of the day. And then he was convicted of sedition by the Roman Empire. And then he was executed as a common criminal in a method that was reserved only for the most vile and despicable people in society. And what Christians were doing was walking around saying, that guy is God. That makes no sense whatsoever. And so the gospel is a shameful thing. It's a foolish thing, right? We talk about the cross of Jesus Christ, the resurrection of Jesus Christ after being executed on the cross. Do you remember what the old hymn says about the cross? On an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame, right? And so Paul says right at the get-go, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why? You better have a darn good reason. Why? Well, it is the power of God for salvation. You can argue that the deepest human yearning is for salvation. We want to know that we're going to be okay. When something great is going on, we say, oh, I hope it lasts because something bad's bound to happen, right? When something horrible is going on, we say, I hope I'm going to get through this. We want to know that at the end of the day, it's a happy ending, right? That's one way to look at our deep yearning for salvation. Paul says the message of the gospel is God's power to bring about salvation. And so we have to talk about what that salvation is. This salvation that comes from the power of God comes to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now, Martin Luther had been taught, and the world tends to believe, that in order for everything to turn out okay, for us, it is a reward for our doing well. But we can't do well enough. We can't do well enough. But Paul says salvation is not a reward for your good behavior. What is it? Where does it come from? It comes from our belief in what God does. If you've learned anything in this Bible study, please learn that the story of the Bible and the story of humanity and the story of all history is a story first about God. This is what God has done. The Christian message is not about you must believe something. It is about look at what God has done. This is the power of God. That's where everything begins, in the power of God, right? We are called to believe it. That's all we have to do is believe it, that God has done something amazing. That belief, that faith, that salvation, that relationship with God is open to everybody, Jew first and also Greek. That includes everybody, right? Jew first in the sense that God's story of restoring the creation to its original purpose. You know this now because you've studied almost the whole Bible. That story begins not with the creation of everything, but with the creation of the nation of Israel, the people of God. God comes to somebody who is not a Jew. Abraham was not a Jew. There was no such thing at that point. God comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and I'm going to tell the world who I am and show the world who it should be through you. That's the story of the Jews. So in a sense, the gospel story begins with Abraham and the presence of the gospel message about God's love and God's power to save and redeem. That is all contained there in the Old Testament. Right? So it comes in that sense to the Jew first. But it's not about the priority of the Jews over others. It's simply about a historical statement of the way the story unfolded, the way God made the story happen. And it was meant to be a story then for everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, right? For in it, Paul says, in this gospel story, in the power of God, the righteousness of God is revealed. It's another way to look at this issue. Human beings believe that in order to make everything turn out okay at the end, we have to be righteous. Follow these rules, these regulations, live this way, live that way, everything will turn out good for you in life. Paul says here, the good news is about God's righteousness. That's what we focus on, not our own, but the righteousness of God. We say Jesus was righteousness. It was the righteousness of God that took Jesus to the cross. There's more to say about that. It's all contained in this one little set of sentences here. The righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. God is righteous. God is loving. God does renew and heal and redeem and restore. That's who God is. That's what God does. Open your eyes and see it. Believe it. Through faith, for faith. Why would Paul say through faith, for faith? This is about our faith and then our faithfulness. That's the way I like to term it, right? Faith is believing something. Faithfulness is acting on what you believe. Does that make sense to you? Here's where, in a sense, our part comes in this. Not our part in guaranteeing our salvation, but what we do after we believe. If we believe. If we believe, we act differently. That changes our lives. Another way this is discussed in the Scriptures is to talk about justification and sanctification. We are justified. We are made right with God because God made things right with us in His gift of grace and love in Jesus Christ. And then because we are justified, once we believe that, once we know that, once we trust that, then we trust Jesus to teach us the right way to live, and we trust that Jesus gives us that power to live in the right way through the gift of the Holy Spirit, and we actually begin to live differently. That's the life of sanctification, living as holy people. But it starts with what God does because of who God is. It is through faith, for faith. As it is written, Paul says, the one who is righteous will live by faith. As it is written. Remember that Paul, as a Pharisee, was an expert in the Old Testament. He knew it up one side and down the other. When Jesus arrived, that caused a huge problem for Paul because the way Paul had viewed the Old Testament, Jesus couldn't possibly be the Messiah until Paul has a come to Jesus moment when Jesus comes to him and says, oh, by the way, Paul, I am the Messiah, right? And so Paul spends the next 14, 15 years completely rereading, reinterpreting the Old Testament, the Scriptures, and then figuring out who Jesus is, and that's the message that Paul is preaching. And so as he is speaking here about what God has done in Jesus, what comes to Paul's mind is a brief phrase from the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk. Habakkuk, from Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, where Habakkuk says, the righteous will live by faith. Now, in Habakkuk, we have one of the minor prophets, very short book. It's a great book to become a specialist in. If you want to say, I am a specialist in one of the books of the Bible, Habakkuk is a great book to choose because it's only got 4 chapters, right? Don't pick Leviticus, or Chronicles or some of those, right? So Habakkuk is writing to a situation where Israel is falling apart. It's beset by enemies within and enemies on outside, enemies on the inside, corruption, all kinds of things. And Habakkuk is crying out to God, how can we possibly live in this intolerable situation? And he comes to that realization that God says, the righteous are going to live by faith. And in a sense, it's faith in both sides of faith. Faith in believing in the trustworthiness of God and the ultimate purpose of God to heal and redeem and renew. And it's living by faith. It is faithfully doing what God wants us to do, regardless of the rest of the world falling apart around us. That passage comes to Paul's mind as he is speaking here about how we live. Trust God. Trust God by believing that this is true, and then trust God by living as if this is true. And here we come to one of my favorite illustrations of faith and faithfulness, and that is to talk about the chair that you're sitting in. How many of you have ever walked up to a chair and looked at it and said, I'm not going to sit down in that chair because I do not believe it will hold me up? Have you ever come to that? Right? Right? In an antique store, right? You see this rickety old... Now, usually you don't sit down because if it breaks, you're going to pay for it. But, right? When you walk up to a chair and decide if you're going to sit down in it or not, you don't realize that you do this, but you evaluate it before you sit down in it. You look at it, and if it looks like a trustworthy chair, you sit down. If it doesn't look trustworthy, if you don't have faith in the chair, you don't sit down. That's kind of the transaction that happens. You have faith in God, and you trust. So you actually then do something because of that trust. That's the dynamic that we're talking about here. So, in some sense, this is a magnificent summary of the entire gospel of Jesus Christ. It points us first to what God has done in Jesus, to the power of God, to our powerlessness, to God's call to us to be faithful, to believe, and then to act on that belief. If you do not act on a belief, then do you really believe it? Jack, go sit in that chair. No, thank you. Don't you believe it'll hold it up? Yeah. Why don't you go sit in it? Well, I'm not so sure. Right? So, belief and trust. So then we continue on. Romans chapter 5, another way of looking at this, right? More description of it. I kind of look at this lesson as here's this beautiful, magnificent jewel that is the heart of our faith. And like all cut jewels, there are some facets, some sides, right? Isn't that what you call it, a facet? One side of the jewel. There are some that are bigger than others, right? These are the big ones. These are the big ones. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Focus on that idea of peace with God. Look at the opposite of that. What happens if you spend your life and end up your life as God's enemy? Is life going to go well? Nope. You're toast. If you are God's enemy. If God is your enemy. Out of all the enemies that you could have in the world, and there are plenty of options there, right? The last one that you want to be your enemy is God. The whole world could be your enemy. And if God is your friend, who cares, right? If God is your friend. God wins, so you want God on your side. So this is another way Paul is talking about this, that because our justification, that word justify is an important word. We are considered just. We are considered righteous. We are counted as righteous, even though we are not. We are counted as righteous, deserving of God's love, even though we are not. We still have God's love. That's how we are treated. That's the gospel message. Because of that, because we believe that, then we are at peace with God. How many of you have perfect peace in your heart and soul and life right now? If anybody raises a hand, you're wrong. None of us have that perfectly, do we? Right? But that's what we want, isn't it? So part of the good news of the gospel is we have peace with God. God has laid out peace terms for us. And you know what the terms of peace are with God? Just trust it. Isn't that fascinating? You don't have to do anything. You don't have to fulfill these conditions. We have peace with God. And it's that peace that Paul would say passes all understanding. Right? It passes all understanding. And because of that peace, then Paul goes on to say, we won't read the rest of this passage, we have peace with God. Therefore, when we suffer, our suffering produces endurance. Our endurance produces character. Our character produces hope. Right? Look at all these amazing things that come from this fundamental fact of our peace with God. We have everything we need to live life, to live faithfully because of peace with God. This peace has come to us. We know it's there because of what God has done on the cross. And then we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 31. But the passage begins this way. This again is Paul speaking. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Most of you were in the study last year when we looked at 1 and 2 Corinthians. Remember, one of the big problems in Corinth was that Corinth was a normal human place. People from all over the world who, regardless of their faith and their philosophy and their religion and their culture and their background, they were just like people everywhere. They believed that in order to have a happy and good and successful life, you needed to be rich, powerful, beautiful, popular, all those things that I am, right? That's what you had to have. And Paul was saying to the Corinthians, no, that's not what it's about. Don't pursue those things. Those things do not make you happy. What does make you happy? Peace with God. And yet, it's for the way the world looks at things, that's foolish. That's ridiculous. Now, I would ask you this, has the world changed? Nope. Nope. Look at anything that exists in our culture or any other culture, and it's all about how to be rich, powerful, beautiful, popular, successful, all of that stuff. The gospel message is foolishness from the way the world looks at itself. But as Christians, we look at the world through a completely different lens, with a completely different mindset, through the lens of Christ, through the lens of the cross. The message about the cross is foolishness. The cross, there again, that cross, that old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame, the one that makes no sense whatsoever. If you've never visited our cross wall that's around the corner here in the entrance to the Fellowship Center, there was a quotation there that I had placed there decades ago now from Dallas Willard, who talks about the fact that the cross, which was an emblem of disgust, disgrace, horror, shame, absolute destructiveness of a life ending as poorly as it could possibly live, the cross instead has become the symbol of the greatest hope and power and faith and love and redemption and service and sacrifice. That's what we say when we're wearing a cross. We don't realize that anymore. We see beautiful gold crosses and all these beautiful ones on the wall over there. Nobody would ever think to put a cross anywhere, but that's how God changes things. So the foolishness of the gospel to those who are perishing, those who don't have faith in this God, who don't see what God is doing, they're going the wrong direction. They're going off a cliff, even though they don't know it, right? But to those of us who are being saved, it is what? It is, there again, the power of God. The power of God. The gospel is about what God has done first. This is what we call a prevenient grace. Prevenient grace. That's a word that Calvinists are very fond of. If you want to impress other Calvinists, start talking about prevenient grace. You say, oh, you know who we are, what we're talking about, right? What is prevenient? It simply means prior. Grace comes first. Before you were even born, before you even had a chance to screw up, God loved you. God's love is steadfast. Chesed, that Old Testament word. God loved you before you messed up, and your messing up doesn't change God's love for you. That's part of the gospel message. Another way to talk about that. We go on to 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11. And this is we believe this is one of the earliest summaries of faith. We have lots of evidence, just kind of in the way the language is put together, the way it flows, the way it's easy to remember and repeat. We think that some of this language is language that the church latched onto early on as a convenient summary way of talking about what the message of Jesus is. And I do want to read just a little bit about that. This is 1 Corinthians 15. Now I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you, which you in turn received, in which you also stand, through which also you are being saved, if you hold firmly to the message that I proclaimed to you, unless you have come to believe in vain. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Okay. The Christian message is not our message. We don't own it. We don't control it. It's not about us. It's a message we received that we hand on. It's a message about Jesus and what happened with Jesus. What happened with Jesus? He was crucified, dead, and buried. He descended into hell. The third day, he rose again from the dead. The thought and language of the Apostles' Creed comes out of this language here in 1 Corinthians 15. What is of first importance? We just celebrated Easter. Of first importance is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the grave. If you do not have the resurrection, you do not have Christian faith. We have nothing to say. Jesus was a great guy. Jesus was a popular teacher. Jesus was all about love and forgiveness and peace. Jesus did some amazing miracles, but other people had been reported that they had done amazing miracles. Jesus was, as Muslims believe, a great prophet. Jesus was a friend of mine. Jeremiah was that in from Jeremiah was a bullfrog? Jesus was a friend of mine, right? What is one of those, right? Jesus was a lot of great stuff, but there's lots of people that we could say that about in history. What we cannot say about anybody else is that they were resurrected from the dead and that they live still in the power of the Spirit. Here is the proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. People ask me all the time and say, what's the difference between Christians and everybody else? All religions are the same. And in a sense, you can say that. All religions want to talk about having a relationship with God, how you do that, about how we treat each other. That's true. They talk about that. But only one religion, only Christianity says that God died for us and God was resurrected for us. And there isn't anything you can do or cannot do that is going to change God's love for you. And it is all proven by the resurrection. The resurrection is the non-negotiable thing in Christian faith. Without it, you cannot have anything else. Here, Paul is proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus and telling us what it was. If you noticed Sunday, every Easter since I've been here, this is what we use as our affirmation of faith at the end of our Easter services, because this is the first proclamation of the resurrection as the church used that. Then we continue on, 2 Corinthians 4, verses 1 through 15. For we do not proclaim ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. We do not proclaim ourselves. So many other religions, so many other philosophies and faith practices come down to what someone else says is true, or come down to supporting and lifting up that particular teacher or that particular leader, that particular system, that culture. But Christianity is not about us. It's about Jesus. It's about what God has done, and it takes us into service. The church does not exist for itself. Those who serve the church do not serve the church for ourselves. We serve the church for the sake of Jesus Christ. One of the ways that the church has gotten off track terribly, and still does, is when people begin to think that the church is about themselves. It's about making you happy and prosperous and making your children obey and your pets never wee where they're not supposed to, and everything in life goes well, right? That's not what Christian faith is. Christian faith is not about making the church rich and powerful and central. Christian faith is about giving ourselves away for the sake of others. So anytime you have an expression of Christian faith that is all about lifting itself up and saying, we're the best, we're cool, we're the most important, everything is meant to be about us, watch out. You're in trouble. Because the Christian faith is not about us. That's what is said here. We do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and we are your slaves for Jesus' sake. Remember here in 2 Corinthians, there were plenty of people in Paul's time, there are plenty of people today, that in Paul's time they would come into a community and say, we've got the truth, we're going to heal you, we're going to make everything better, start giving us your money, start turning your lives over to us, right? And Paul says, look, that's not the kind of guy I am, because that's not who Jesus was. That's not what Christian faith is. It's about serving you, right? It's about serving you. So that's a very important aspect of what our fundamental faith is. It turns us into slaves of other people, right? And now, what kind of selling point is that? Hi, I can't wait for you to sign up. Join my cause, join my crowd, join my organization. You're going to become a slave to other people. You want to sign up? You know, where do I sign up on the dotted line? I don't think so. But that's what people did. That's what people did. Then Galatians 1, verses 1 through 10. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. There's that problem that I talked about at the beginning. The problem is that the pull of the world's way of looking at everything is so strong, telling us that it's about us, telling us it's about our ability to achieve our own salvation, telling us it's about our comfort and ease and happiness and joy. The way of the world is so powerful that it's easy to get people off track, including you and me. And so we have to continually come back to what the message and what the story actually is. Just a few years after a church was founded here in Galatia, people were coming in and they were twisting the gospel message. They were convincing people that they needed to go back to Judaism, or that they needed to incorporate other pagan practices and ideas. They needed to be more like the world rather than more like Jesus. It's a problem back then, it is a problem now. And then Colossians 1, 15 to 23. This is another of the great early summaries of Christian faith, of the proclamation of who Jesus is, right? And I want to read that for us because it's such a beautiful thing. This is, you would do worse than to mark all of these scriptures in your Bible as some of the central scriptures to keep coming back to time and time and time again. Read them, read them, read them, read them. Understand what they say, right? There are parts of the Bible you only need to look at every few years or so. But these are the parts you need to look at all the time. This is about Jesus Christ. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. We often use this statement as an affirmation of our faith at the end of a worship service. It focuses on Jesus Christ, the head of the church. When we look at Jesus, we see God. When we look at what Jesus said and did, we see God at work. The impact, the effect of what Jesus said and did was to bring us back to God and help us see God's forgiveness, God's grace offered to us, the gift of learning how to actually live a successful life. We say that Jesus is the head of the church. Jesus makes the church happen. You wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Jesus. Whether you believe in Jesus or not, if you show up in a church, that's because of Jesus, right? Jesus can do stuff with you, and you don't even have to believe in Jesus, right? Just ask Paul about his little trip to Damascus. The beginning of the constitution of the Presbyterian Church begins this way. It says, Jesus Christ is the Lord of the church. He is the head of the church. The existence of this church does not depend on you. It does not depend on me. It depends on Jesus making it happen. And the miracle is that he still does. That's a beautiful thing, isn't it? So with all of these things, you have a beautiful summary of the heart of the Christian message. This is the heart of the gospel. We have to look at all the facets of it and understand the different challenges to the gospel that occur in our own hearts, in our own twisted thinking, and the thinking that is there out in the world, that is present also in the church, and we continually have to stay aligned with that truth and learn more about what that truth is for us. And it all, of course, it starts with Jesus, it ends with Jesus, everything is about Jesus. That's God with us and the power of the Spirit. That's the Christian message. If you learn nothing else in this Bible study, learn this. It's important. Hello. And learn also not to touch your microphone when you're talking. Questions, thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
Jack, did Martin Luther ever understand that he was forgiven or that he was part of this greater thing that he wasn't?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Did Martin Luther understand? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He read this passage, he says in his biography, and reading this passage and coming to understand what it was the weight of the world that was lifted from his shoulders. And it's what gave him, I believe then, the courage to stand up against the institutional church. So then later on in attacking, Luther was simply trying to help the church come back, to get back on course. That's what all the reformers were trying to do. They didn't plan to start new churches. They simply wanted the church to be the church that it was meant to be. And so his 95 theses were descriptions of the problems in the church, the way the church had gotten off base, how it could get back. And he posted those on Instagram. That's what the door of the church in Wittenberg was. If you wanted to get your message, I thought Martin Luther got in trouble because I grew up the son of a carpenter, and he went and he put a nail hole in a perfectly good door. You would never do that. But no, the door of the church was the bulletin board. So Martin Luther posted his 95 complaints, recommendations, his theses about the church on the door of the church in Wittenberg. And the rest is history.
What did the Catholic Church do? Did they kind of excommunicate him?
Oh yeah, the Catholic Church basically said you're all wet, right? And threw him out of the church. Most of the reformers were thrown out of the church. They didn't intentionally leave the church. They were thrown out of the church. And all they were trying to do was bring the church back to where it needed to be. Yeah. Yeah. Read history of the Reformation sometime. It's absolutely fascinating. Good. All right, we should stop. Sorry, one question, whatever. Great to be with you. I hope you've had a wonderful time. You've got a few more weeks of that coming. Lord God, thank you for the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ, in whom we have peace with you and peace with each other. Help us to share that peace throughout the world as we share your love for Jesus' sake. Amen. God bless you, my children.